Okay, well, let's get to it. So, super excited to get started with this painting, and I just wanted to run you through some of the things that we'll be using, some of the materials that we'll be using to create this work. But before we begin, before we do that, I just want to kind of set a little mantra for this lesson. So I pulled this one out of a little tin of inspirational words that I have in the studio, and what came out was, do not be afraid to make a mistake today. That is how we learn. And I think that's very, very apt for this kind of activity, this kind of painting, the kind of painting that I teach. I love to embrace the happy accident. I love to push myself in directions that are not comfortable. So even with approaching this work, this is not the way that I normally work. It's not the subject matter that I normally would work with. But I'm really excited to do it, and I'm excited to share it with you. And I'm in that kind of space of curious learning. What's going to happen? What's going to come from this experience? And I hope that you can put yourself into that space as well, because it's kind of like the other side of fear. So curiosity can invoke anxiety, or it can invoke a kind of playful investigation of theme and materials and technique. And so that's where I want us to be. There are no mistakes. There is no way that we can do this wrong. There are only ways that we can push forward and try to realize the vision of what is in front of us in this photo, or what is in our heads, and to try and get that out onto the paper. And really it comes with doing the work, as Ira Glass said in his famous quote about how when we start we have really good taste and we know what it is that we want to get out of our heads and onto the page, but we don't yet know how to do it. We don't yet have the skills and the techniques to get that vision from our minds onto the page. And so we get frustrated, and then oftentimes we give up. And it's only by doing the work and pushing through the mistakes and learning from them that we get to the place where we can get those images out of our head and onto the page. Okay, so we got to do the work, everyone. And so this is part of doing the work. So okay, let's have a look at what we've got in front of us. So what I have are some oil pastels in some warm colors, because I'm really feeling like at the end of this piece, I'm going to want to add in a little pizzazz with some really bright and warm oil pastel flicks and flecks to get those warm pops on the trees happening. So I'll pop those aside for now because we won't be using them for quite a while. Then I also have a variety of Daler Rowney inks. So some of the colors I have out in front of me are Payne's Grey, White, Process Cyan, Rowney Blue, Flame Orange, Lemon Yellow, Antelope Brown, Burnt Umber, and Red Earth. Over on the right here, I have some golden fluids. So these are golden fluid acrylics, and I have them out in magenta, pyrrole orange, cadmium red, Payne's Grey, nickel azo yellow, green gold, and quinacridone burnt orange. I can't say at this point if I'm going to be using all of these. I've just pulled them out because looking at the image, these are some of the colors that pop out to me, and I like to have the things around me, the tools that I need, so that I'm not rushing off to try and find them and breaking the flow if I am in that flow of painting. I also have some green gold in the fluid acrylics and some nickel azo gold. And then in the heavy bodied golden, I have some titanium white. I have some ultramarine blue in a Matisse, and I also have some light ultramarine blue, and it feels like those will be great in the sky. So let's start with that. I may need to pull some other colors in. We'll see how we go. Pop our little mantra over to the side here. And you can also see that I have some willow charcoal. And I have a gold gel pen, and I just feel like that might be another really lovely addition right at the end. So this one is, I'm just trying to look at the brand of this one. I buy all kinds of different brands, and this one is a Pentel, and basically it just says it's a Pentel hybrid gel pen. I have a variety of brushes in front of me as well. When I'm using the inks, I like to have several wide, flat, very kind of sharp-edged brushes. And you'll see why in a little while. The way that they will draw the ink out into the surrounding water is really beautiful. So you don't want anything too bristly. You don't want anything with uneven bristles at the top. I haven't got a particular brand that I love. I collect these brushes, and I collect them from all over the place. Some of them are more expensive than others, but most of them are fairly inexpensive. This one I found in Mexico at an art supply store for about $1, and it works just great. And then others I have found at art supply stores here in Australia. Martha Stewart has some great ones online, craft brushes with this lovely flat edge. So that's the only criteria, is that you don't want a raggedy edge. You want a nice smooth edge and a wide flat brush to pull the inks out. And then I also have a couple of other brushes that are a little smaller as well, just in case we want to get into some detail. But we're definitely going to start with the larger brushes, because I want us to stay free, and using a large brush is a great way to just really free yourself up. We're going to work in layers with these inks and acrylic paints, and we're going to start with thin layers and work our way up to thicker layers, okay? So as I mentioned, I have two images that I'm going to be looking at. I have an image that I created a few days ago that is probably a little more detailed. It also has a little higher contrast with more darks. And then I have the image that we just created in the earlier video, and this one is more abstracted, more blurred, and it has a higher degree of intensity in those warm colors. So I'm going to kind of have the iPad up in front of me and toggle back and forth between those images and see what we can come up with. So what I'd like to do to begin with is to just use a piece of willow charcoal, and I'm going to just run a line along kind of the edge of the darkest areas. So coming in, just roughly letting my eye skim across the top of the darker areas. And then I feel like that might go a little bit higher up there. There's going to be a lot of time where we'll be able to adjust, but we just want to get these shapes in as best we can at this point. Right now I'm working from the first image, which has more darks. And less intense reds. I'm going to start over here as well, just to make sure that I'm not coming too far across. So I'm going to have a look at where these darks are up here. And I'm also looking very carefully at the negative spaces between. So I feel like this actually comes out here further, and negative shapes in between. Don't be afraid to kind of readjust, reassess. We'll have plenty of time to do this actually in the application of the paints and inks as well. Okay, so there's a lot of dark down here in this image, a lot around here, down the bottom here. I'm just going to go back and have a look at the other image and just compare. So I kind of like in this one how the dark comes around. There's more red through here. There's less darks, there's more red through here. You know, in this bottom layer, I think I'm going to work more with the intense image. So, you know, just having this willow charcoal is allowing me to kind of almost like physically take my brain, my eyes from looking at the image and then like imagining it here on the page. So even though I've just created a whole bunch of a mishmash of lines, it's kind of helping my brain, you know, understand and wire itself to actually now send the message to my hands to get the shapes in the right places. So I think, you know, just even looking at this second image, the much brighter image, I think, is what I'm heading towards working with. So I'm going to begin with some Payne's Grey in the acrylic inks. And I'm going to start with some of these dark shapes. So in this image, they actually come down from here, and there's a dark shape on this side. There's red in the middle here. There's a dark shape coming over here and going down towards the bottom. So I'm not going to outline every dark shape all at once because I don't want the ink to dry. I want it to stay nice and fluid so I can move it around just like this. Pull it up and around where that red is going to be. And you can see how just working with these flat, wide brushes can really, you know, make that ink just spread in really beautiful ways. Just feeling my way around with the brush, and I'm noticing that there's going to be lots of reds, pops of reds and oranges in through here. A little bit of this ink goes a long way, so try not to put too much on. When I'm actually applying the ink, I am not even squeezing the dropper. What I'm doing is just running the edge of the dropper along where I see the dark shape, and the ink is just kind of coming out by itself. I'm not pushing at all. So down here, we have a little bit of dark, it kind of comes up here. And of course, this doesn't have to be exact. This is just an interpretation. Okay. So let's pull this in here. Keeping your brush quite wet in order to allow this ink to kind of flow along the surface of the page. We're not trying to no need to use no need to use a detail brush. We're not trying to get any detail, we're just trying to get some broad expanses of dark. We're just, almost like, usually with an image you have to like squint your eyes to find the dark, but because we've already abstracted this image so much, it's much easier for us to find those darks. I actually feel like that needs to go over there a little bit more. And that here. And this is going to come up here. And then of course I can intensify and deepen the dark areas in subsequent layers. Even just play with moving around the ink from one area to another. So that some areas are deeper than others. There's going to be a whole area of red in here that I've kind of probably missed. I've gone too far up, but that's okay. We can work with that. And this up here is to go further. And just to get a sense of where those trunks come up and how high they come up. There's a whole bunch of dark up here, underpinning the colours, the brighter colours on top. And one tree is almost kind of connected to the other tree. Probably more there. So just, don't be afraid to like make adjustments as we go. Obviously that's now a really fat trunk, but that's okay. Later on when that dries, I can push it back and I can get more of the negative space of the blue in between by bringing some other paint over the top. So try not to stress about, what you perceive as mistakes along the way. They're not mistakes, they're just little tiny things that need to be adjusted. So just getting those darks in where I see them. Wherever my eye perceives that there's something dark, I'm just getting that in this initial layer. Okay? All right. And as we talked about, that sketch tool in Light can be a great way to, you could also, print out this image using that sketch tool, and that might make it even easier for you to see those dark areas. All right, the next color I'm going to bring in is one I forgot to mention, but definitely one that we're going to be needing, and it is Flame Red in the acrylic ink. And so while this Payne's Grey is still fairly, some of it is wet, some of it is not. So I'm just going to come straight over the top, and it's going to make some other interesting colors where it mingles with the black, because we don't want to just have a red shape, a black shape. We're going to layer up until we're happy. So same with this red. I'll take it around the edges where you see it. We'll add some orange in a moment. There's a whole, almost like a red kind of rectangular shape up here. Has lots of other tones in it as well, but essentially it's got a lot of red. And then there's going to be red along the edges here as well, but I'm probably not going to play with that too much just yet, because a lot of those highlights on the trees, we may as well just really establish the shape of the trees first, and that's going to take a while. So I feel like those highlights on the trees are going to be something that comes later on. So we'll just make sure you get your brush nice and clean. And have some paper towels handy as well, so that we can, when we start to get quite layered and quite messy, we can actually wipe our brushes in between layers. So let's just move this red around. And so we just begin to establish some of these colors, some of these layers and shapes. Don't be afraid of the red blending with the darker colors. We're just really popping in these bottom layers. So the next base color I'm going to bring in is some Nickel Azo Gold in the golden fluid. Just a couple of drops, because a little bit goes a long way also with the golden fluid. And I'm just going to allow my eyes to move around and see if I can find the places where I might add little dabs of this golden Nickel Azo Gold. So it's like every time you pull a new color into the palette, you kind of have to switch your brain into, you know, becoming like a heat-seeking missile for that particular color. So, you know, I notice that there's little bits that go up here, there's little bits that kind of come up here, and we may even have to bring those back in again later. It may be even that we have them in the wrong place, but it's all just getting our brains to begin to see what's actually here on the picture in front of us, and trying to make sense of how we can make that happen. Okay. So one thing I noticed just as I applied that yellow into this area up here is that I feel like this dark shape is probably a little too low. So I have a bit of wet ink right here, and I'm going to just take that up a little further, which means that this one also needs to go up further. So these are the kind of adjustments that you can make as we move along. And it's also going to be a matter of, you know, as the image begins to form, you'll have like an intuitive sense of what's working and what's not. Okay. So I'm not going to bring in any greens at this point. I feel like the greens and the really hot reds and oranges along the trunks are going to come towards the end. I'd like to establish a little bit of the sky in this application, in this layer. So I'm going to stick with the inks, and I'm going to bring a little of the darker blue, the browny blue, along the edges of these shapes, and then come over the top with a process cyan, and that'll be our first layer, which we will then let dry. So again, a little bit goes a long way. Pull a little bit up around the trees here, a little bit up around these areas in between, and that's about that. And I'm going to pull in a little bit of the blue just to balance things out down in some of these dark areas as well. So coming up to the sky first, because I don't want this to dry. as a hard edge or a hard line. I'm just going to really quickly and fluidly pull this colour around. And then play with the blue in some areas of the foreground. Using our paper towel, kind of lift any areas where we feel like we might have gone too far. And then I've just changed my mind, which I often do. I feel like I put so much blue into that sky that if I just run some white ink rather than the browny blue, rather than the processed cyan, if I add some white into the mix, I should be able to take one of my large brushes and pull that deeper blue even further out with the white. Yeah, that's nice. So that we get lovely variation from dark to light happening. How beautiful is that? I might even leave some of that really interesting kind of flowering happening. Yeah, that's lovely. And so while I've got that brush in my hand, I'm going to come down into some areas. I'm going to even see if I can establish like where some of those light colors are between the trees. So kind of making my eyes squint again and bring some of the lights in where I see them. And of course, all of this will have to be, re-established time and time again, but it gives us a start. And you can see already kind of getting a feel for, those trees and foliage in there. So you can see, just coming in with that wider brush, how freeing that can be, and how it can really, really loosen you up. Now the page is quite wet with this first layer, and I forgot to mention, I'm just going to smooth out some of this. I forgot to mention that I am working on a watercolor pad, a watercolor block. So these blocks are beautiful to work with because it's a high quality watercolor. It's a Fabriano pad, Fabriano block, and it's 12 inches by 12 inches. And I just love working with them because you don't have to worry about the paper buckling. Each piece of paper is glued to the one underneath, and so when you're working on it, it's quite substantial. It feels more like you're working on a piece of board. And once you're done, then you can actually just lift the page off from the block underneath. So I'm going to leave this layer to dry. I forgot to move that little bit around up there. So I'll leave this layer to dry, and then we're going to come back in with the next layer. So happy so far. I hope that you're just feeling nice and loose and free, and that you're remembering to use your wide brushes and to keep the ink quite fluid, and just to allow these types of things to happen that are accidental, but they look beautiful. We can decide later on whether we want to keep all of that kind of flowering effect or not. But for now, this is a great first layer. So with the underlayer now dry, it's time for us to come in and add a little more shape and color. I guess what we're doing in a sense is we're doing something very similar to what we were doing when we were using the Clever Painter app. So moving from those really broad strokes and then coming in and becoming less broad, a little more detailed, and then finally at the end deciding just how much is enough detail. So I think that's what we're playing with this kind of semi-abstract landscape. How much do we want to describe with our paint strokes, and how much do we want the viewer to kind of use their imagination to see what there is to be seen. So what I want to play with now, there's a lot of complementary colors going on in this piece, with the blues against the oranges. So they're the major kind of colors happening there. So I want to have a little bit more play between two minor complementary colors. And there's just the tiniest touch of kind of purple or magenta purpley kind of colors within this. So I'm going to play with that a little bit and use my artistic license to add something to this piece that is not necessarily in the photo, but something that I feel will work well. So we're looking at kind of purplish tones, and then the opposite to that, of course, is yellow on the color wheel. So I'm going to just pop the yellow a little bit more in some of these areas. Just little by little, and move that yellow around, and it's just going to give us a slightly different kind of tone across the reds and across that nickel azo gold. You can see that where I pull it up across the blue, we begin to get some green tones, so maybe we'll play with that a little. So that wasn't intentional, but then, sometimes you notice things as you're moving along and then you just go with them. So now I'm noticing, where the greens actually are and changing my mind, where I said to you guys before, let's leave the greens to the end. Well, I have this yellow on my brush and I'm noticing that it's giving me some beautiful greens, so why not? Why not move it around and establish some of those now, and we can always add more layers later. And then kind of on the opposite end of the scale, we're going to go to a magenta, which is a cool red. So that will act as a counterpoint to the warmer reds, and getting over, not a pure complementary, it's not completely opposite to the yellow, but it's getting over on the opposite side of the yellow. So I'm just going to add the magenta to my palette here. I'm just using a piece of cardboard as my palette. I often use paper or watercolor paper as my palette and then create paintings from it. And I have a whole section, whole weekly section in my Paint Mojo e-course where we look at palettes of possibility and create paintings from our palettes. So just taking some of the magenta, and I'm going to kind of play along some of the edges where I can see some of those purple tones, but I'm going to be careful not to kind of mix too much with the yellow, because that will give us some muddier tones. I just want to bring in a little bit of some different not wanting those sharp edges, so I'm just going to push that out a little where I can. Some places are already dry and that's fine. And then I'm going to bring a little bit of the magenta into these darker areas below. And overlap up into some of the reds. In fact, I might just pull that magenta across the whole bottom dark there. Just leave a few bits here and there for point of difference. Okay. And then I've just noticed up here that there's some yellow that I didn't move around yet. So we can see those layers are kind of offering a little bit more complexity. So looking further into the piece, I'm just trying to see, you know, what can I do to bring some more layers over the top to increase the sense of depth even more. And so I have in front of me some red earth in the ink, and that's going to give me just some earthier tones. So I'm going to play with that a little bit where I see it. So I see some across the top edge here. I see some in the center of some of these red areas. If it doesn't work, or if you don't like the feeling that you get after you've placed it on there, you can always come back in and bring a brighter red over the top. So nothing is like the end step until it's the end step, if that makes sense. This is all just a part of the progress of the piece. So I want you to kind of see if you can get away from judging your piece too harshly when it's actually just in progress. Because really all we should be doing is just making a decision and then trying something and then making another decision. If that doesn't work, or if you feel like it needs something else, then you just put the something else in. There's no need to like kind of freak out when the painting's actually just in the stages of being developed. I'm just using my eye to kind of push my brush around where I can see some of those earthier tones. Even sometimes, you know, your brush strokes can kind of emulate what you're seeing, if that makes sense. Like I'm just seeing the edges of the shapes. I'm almost just like willing my brush to create those shapes. So not overworking the stroke, not trying too hard. Coming down to some of these areas here. Just taking that new color, that red earth, for a little walk around the piece. Noticing places that I see it. Where the areas kind of connect together as well. What I want to work on now is just adding a little bit more diversity to the sky area. Just bringing in a few different colors, but I don't want to change it up too much. So I'm going to bring in some heavy-bodied acrylic paints, but I'm going to use quite a bit of water with those so that I can move them around and keep this feeling of flow. But what I also want to do is to work on the negative spaces in between the trees as I see them in this image in front of me. So I'm using a cobalt teal in Matisse, and then one of the golden light ultramarine blues, and then also a Matisse ultramarine blue. So I kind of switch back and forth between brands of heavy-bodied acrylics. So we live in a small town, so it really depends on what I can get my hands on at the local art supply store. So let's just have a look that in between. We're going to try and establish some of these negative spaces in between the trees. So I'm going to start right here and just going to work on getting in little diversity in colour. And at the same time, building up. A little layering, building up a little layering in the sky area. While I have this colour on my brush, this ultramarine blue, I'm going to bring it down into, just so that it's not just in the top areas, I'm going to bring it down along some of the edges of these darks. Sometimes it's handy to have a clean brush nearby, just to move these colours around a little. I'm going to move down to a smaller brush now and bring in some of the teal. I don't want to get rid of all of the layers underneath. I'm just trying to bring in some different interesting shapes and tones within the sky. I'm actually going to put a little bit of the titanium white on my palette as well, so that I can lighten up some of these colours. Just mixing a little of that teal with the white, and again kind of looking at the shapes around the trees and where these little peak holes occur. All of these little places up here where these teals come in. While I have it on my brush, I'm just going to bring a layer of the teal into the sky area. Keeping it nice and free. And then I'll use one of my wide, flat brushes that's a little bit wet to just loosen up some of those edges. But I don't mind some of the brush strokes that we can see here. So I'm not trying to get rid of them all, just trying to create a little diversity between the short choppy strokes. So often, like with the edge of this brush, it's a great way to kind of bring in some of those suggestions of light in and amongst the trees. Somewhere right in the middle of that red, there is like a little pop of teal. And again up here, just kind of, train your brain to, like, if at a particular moment you're looking for a pop of teal, then that's what your eye is going to be doing, is just kind of moving it around until it finds all of those areas where you can add the teal. Okay, sweep this across here. And then just with the ultramarine blue in the same brush, I'm going to run it along the edges where we added those kind of purple colors earlier, the magentas. Not everywhere, just in a few places. Once again, just adding a little variety to the palette. I'm enjoying the way that this is progressing. Let's just get a little water on that brush and once again just loosen up where we've added some of those purples in. Just kind of skimming along the edge with water. It's the lightest touch that I'm using just to get some points of difference happening in the sky. Okay. I'm enjoying the softness of the edge and the mixture between some of the softer areas that hit each other, and then some of the brush strokes. So I think I'm always looking for just, kind of just difference between, again, coming back to embracing the contrast, I guess. Let's bring a little of this down here. If at any point you make a move that doesn't feel right, if you work quickly, you can just kind of push back. Alrighty, what's next? So while we have these heavy-bodied paints out, I'm thinking that I would like to bring a little more oomph into this section here. And so I'm going to use some Nickel Azo Yellow, and I'm going to put it on my palette right next to the white so I can move back and forth between different tones of this color. So I'm going to grab a smaller brush, and this color can be quite electric. I'm going to just move it around, maybe even just rolling my brush around into the areas where I see the color. This is an exaggerated version of what I actually do see, but I actually really like it. Again, I can tone this down later by bringing another color over the top or bringing a wash of color. In some areas I see a yellow that's slightly warmer, so I'm going to add a little bit of the flame orange onto my palette next to the yellow, and just see what kind of a color I can get when I mix those two. Well, that's actually quite nice. So I do see like a warmer yellow up here, a little bit here. And I can probably just break these up a little bit as well by coming over the top, pushing them back a little with just a dab. Of the warmer yellow. So I'm not looking to create trees at all. I'm just looking to kind of duplicate the tones that are in this photo and create an interesting painting. I've had to open the door of my studio because it's super hot here right now, and I was just melting, and now we have some visitors, so hopefully they won't bother us too much. Just moving that orange around where I see it, a little bit up through here, but keeping those strokes, just quick and short. Joining areas of different color, allowing some of the underlayers to show through. I'm really enjoying working down in this area. And what I think I'll do now is bring a little bit of the cadmium red into the mix. And just continue with these short strokes, overlapping some of the other colors that I've been placing onto the painting. So we're bringing the reds in, accentuating some of these areas through here. Now my eye is just looking for red, so bringing it in wherever I see it. Kind of a deeper and more vibrant red, which is going to change depending on where I put it and what colors I place it over the top of, obviously. Bringing it down a little into this area. I'm beginning to bring that red up through the tree trunks. Just as I see it. I'm not actually trying to paint a tree trunk or describe the tree trunk. I'm just placing colour where I see it and creating interesting shapes as I do. I noticed that I've actually placed in what look like a couple of other tree trunks over here, and I'm going to leave those. I actually don't mind those, or at least I'm going to leave them for now. Just skimming my eye around to see where are the reds. What kind of shapes do those reds make? As they travel through the painting. And mix some of that red with the ultramarine blue that's on my palette. Just push back a little bit of the reds down in this area here. And perhaps deepen up some of the colour. Let's switch over to a larger brush as well. Don't be afraid to switch brushes when you need to. Let's add a little more of these ultramarine blues up through this area here. There's actually quite a lot of kind of connecting lines and colours that bring these trees towards each other. If it helps you to not call them trees, then try and trick your brain and just kind of talk about just lines and shapes and colour, and try not to even mention soften some of those edges again. Just with my wet brush. Trying to keep everything from becoming too overly defined. You know, if you feel like you have this need to begin to paint a tree, just try and resist it. And just keep going back to the shapes, those abstract shapes and colours that we're focusing on. Remember to kind of vary the direction of your stroke. And I think I want to add one more element in, and that is a quinacridone burnt orange in the golden fluid. It'll give me a warmth that I'm kind of looking for up through these areas. So I may even, let's see, may even just take the burnt orange and bring it as a unifying glaze across some of these areas to connect one color to another. I can always pull it all the way through and then just dab back to bring back some of the lighter areas, and that'll give me less of a hard edge. Okay. So I'm getting pretty happy with this. I think there's something up here that needs a little bit of work. just to knock back those blodgy kind of yellow bits. So I'm going to work on that a little, taking some of the burnt orange, mixing it with the nickel yellow, and kind of coming in, breaking up some of those yellow areas a little. Just knocking back some of those yellows that just seemed like they were a little bit kind of splodgy. All right, I think we're getting there. So sometimes, you know, it's a real push and pull between, you know, moving forwards and then revisiting something. So I'm going to just revisit the Payne's Grey, and where I can see the darkest darks again, I'm going to come over with another kind of layer to re-establish the shapes of the darkest darks. So I'm going to pull up through here. I may not cover everything, but I just want to deepen up some of those areas. Really give the eye somewhere to travel through the piece. So it's always, you know, a push and pull. So I don't want to get rid of everything that I've put underneath, and if I just pulled the Payne's Grey over everything else, that's what would happen. That's not what I'm after. So I'm going to use my paper towel if I need to lift. And I'm going to leave maybe a little bit of linear aspect as well. It's kind of cool, just leaving just a little bit of energetic line. A little jump over to here. I notice that there's actually a patch of green down here that I haven't even thought about. So I'm going to think about whether I want to bring that in. And there's going to be another patch of green up here. So my brain really hasn't yet been thinking about the greens. So just pushing this Payne's Grey around again. Very fluid. Focusing solely on the dark areas. And re-establishing those darkest darks. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to create any line in here, because in the image that we manipulated there isn't a line, but I think I kind of like a suggestion of line through this area. Maybe, maybe not. Let's take it off again. Let's see. And then let's revisit the magenta. Keep coming back to that magenta. Perhaps going to push it over some of these areas. Maybe it's because I was so taken with that image of the Oaxacan women and how beautiful those fuchsias were. I'm just going to move this magenta around some of these areas. I'm getting quite excited now. Really, really liking where it's going. And I think I'm going to finish off with a little bit of the green gold. I'm going to pop it on my palette next to the nickel yellow and the white, and just push that contrast a little bit more with some lighter green or lighter yellow pops. So first of all, down here, it's not really the right green that's showing, but I think I can live with it. I actually love green gold. Up the top there. Actually, what I'm going to do is mix a tiny touch of the teal with that green gold and see if that gives me more of a colour that I'm looking for, or at least another green to play with. Yeah, good. Just going to keep it really loose and find this little area under here. Just spinning my brushes around. Try and pop those greens in where I see them. Doesn't have to make sense. We've already established the base shapes, and we've already established that we like those shapes. So, adding all of this extra, it's just kind of the icing on the cake. Little hints of colour. Bringing that green in just where I see it. Just a short stroke here and there. A little bit down here on the side. Tiny touch there. And I don't want to push it too far. I feel like I might be at a stage where I could just about say we're done here. So what I'm going to do now is bring in a little bit of pastel just at the very end. And so I'm going to take first of all the yellow pastel and just bring a few short, vibrant kind of strokes into a couple of areas. You'll have to wait until the paint is dry, or at least go over areas where the paint is dry to begin to add the pastel in. You could even, if you like, just come in with a little bit of a drawn line through some areas, just for a textural element. And come back with the orange. Not quite sure this is dry enough yet, but let's just try and see. A little bit on the side here. We don't want to go overboard with the orange. It is quite strong in the image, but that doesn't mean that we have to have the same kind of intensity. I think that's looking pretty good. And then just perhaps a little tiny touch here and there of the pink and the red. Again, just kind of working with a scribbly line. It's just giving us just a slight different texture in some areas. And once again, kind of varying the stroke. And I don't want to overdo it. A little tiny bit along here. Teeny bit here. And sometimes at this point it's really valuable just to step away and just assess the piece for a while. I'm going to just push through and finish up. And I'm not going to talk for this last little bit, just because I want to get into, there's something that happens when I feel like I get into like a finishing place, and it's a really intuitive place that I think is really good for you guys to watch, but hard for me to talk about and explain while I'm actually in the middle of finishing. I hope that makes sense. Just trying out a little bit of that line work, and I don't want to go too far overboard with it. And in fact, I don't know, I may even just wait for this dark area, dark ink to dry, and just bring a little tiny touch of the red or a reddish orange back over the top. And then I think we can call the piece done. Let's just bring out a tiny touch of the pyrrole orange, a little bit of the cadmium red, and I feel like maybe I've gotten a little too carried away with some of the detail in here. So, and you know, there's no right or wrong with this. It's how it feels to you and whether you feel that it's done or not. It could have been done before, like a little while ago, before I even started putting all of these finishing touches in. If that felt done to you, depending on where you are with how you're painting and how much detail you like to add, how much abstraction you like to keep, there's no right or wrong about what is done and what is not done. So I'm going to bring a little bit. You'll begin to know when something feels finished. This is just a red and orange blend. Re-establishing where I had those before. Just strengthening the oomph. And again, not going everywhere. Not taking the same kind of intensity around the whole piece, because then you'd lose you know, what the quality of this intense pop of red and orange right here at the end. If I did it everywhere, then the quality of it would be lost. It wouldn't have any kind of specialness. So just bearing that in mind. Sometimes it's best, especially with an abstract piece, to take a photo. I'm kind of looking at it through the lens of the camera right now, and it feels good to me. It feels balanced. It feels like the color shapes, the color blocks are working well, and my eyes traveling around the image, not getting stuck anywhere. And you know, there may be just a couple of little tiny things that I would add in here and there, but really I'm going to put my tools down and call this piece done. So I hope you've enjoyed this mini class. I hope it's taking you to some places that are new to you. I hope it's taking you into some areas of discomfort, because those are the places that we learn from our mistakes, as our mantra stated today. I hope that the Embracing the Contrast exercise has helped you guys in lesson 1. And you can see how I took that into this image as well, even though I wasn't talking about it as much. It's a really helpful tool to just help you make the next move and move your way through a piece. And I hope you've enjoyed playing with the apps, and I'm looking forward to doing much more of that, much more of Embracing the Contrast in Abstract Mojo, which will be my biggest class since my first class, Paint Mojo, which thousands of people have done now since 2014. You know, this is just stretching us that little bit further in our art journey, and I hope you decide to come with me and explore your own potential even more. I've really enjoyed creating this class for you, and I'm going to have Cece, when she's editing, pop up a couple of images at the end of this video. This is the second run through, or complete run through, of this painting, just because of some technical issues that happened while I was filming and uploading. And I have to say, from the very first image that I did, the first painting that I did, let me see if I can find it. Here we go, I'm going to show you, and then I'll have Cece pop them both up at the end. So the first one that I did is quite different than this one. Yeah? And I was really happy with this one. But somewhere in moving between perhaps becoming more familiar with the image and perhaps just becoming even looser as I worked my way through the image, I've come up with a painting that I actually love more than the original one. And you may or may not, this one may appeal to you more than this one. I don't know. But I think it's also a very helpful thing to run through the exercise more than once. You can see how many different versions of the photo you can create using different filters. And then try at least 2, but I'd recommend 3 run-throughs, and just see how much more free you feel when you get to that 3rd one. So thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in another class very, very soon. Happy creating! Bye!